June 3, 1098. Dawn. Inside the walls of Antioch. Bohemond of Taranto stood atop the walls of Antioch as the sun rose over the approaching Muslim army. Behind him, the ancient city that had taken the Crusaders 8 months to capture, now housed an army on the verge of starvation. Ahead, stretching across the plains like an endless sea of steel and silk, came the relief force of Kerboga, Atabeg of Mosul, with perhaps 70,000 warriors. The Christian army numbered perhaps 15,000 men, maybe less. They had no food. They had no water beyond what they could draw from wells inside the city. They had no reinforcements coming. By every military calculation, they were doomed. What Kerboga and his massive army didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that they were marching toward one of history's most improbable victories. Within days, this starving, desperate Christian force would emerge from Antioch's gates and shatter an army 5 times their size. The First Crusade would survive its darkest hour and march toward Jerusalem. But to understand how 15,000 starving men defeated 70,000 well-supplied warriors, we must understand the journey that brought them to Antioch's walls, the faith that sustained them through impossible hardships, and the military innovations that would define Crusader warfare for 2 centuries. This is the story of how religious fanaticism, tactical brilliance, and sheer desperation combined to create one of the most stunning victories in medieval warfare. The First Crusade began on November 27, 1095, when Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont, France, and called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. His speech ignited religious fervor across Europe that transformed into the largest military expedition the Christian world had ever mounted. What emerged was not an organized army under unified command, but multiple contingents led by various nobles, each bringing their own forces, their own supplies, their own ambitions. The main leaders included Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Raymond IV of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, and several others. Each commanded between 1,000 and 5,000 fighting men, plus supporting troops and camp followers. The total force that departed Europe between August 1096 and April 1097 numbered approximately 60,000 people, including perhaps 30,000 fighting men, 7,000 knights, and the remainder being infantry, support personnel, priests, and civilians following the army. This made it the largest Christian military force assembled since the fall of the Roman Empire. The knights who formed the core of this force represented the military elite of Western Europe. Each was a product of years of training and enormous financial investment. A fully equipped knight carried chainmail covering his entire torso and limbs, a conical helmet with nose guard or full great helm, a kite-shaped shield nearly 4 feet tall made of wood covered in leather and reinforced with iron, a lance 10 to 12 feet long, a sword of 3 feet or more, and often secondary weapons like maces or war axes. The destrier, the war horse that carried these knights, was bred specifically for combat. Standing 15 to 16 hands high, weighing 1,200 to 1,400 pounds, these animals were trained from birth to charge into battle, to strike with their hooves, to bite enemy soldiers and horses. A charging knight on a destrier represented over 1,500 pounds of man, horse, and equipment moving at 20 miles per hour, with all that kinetic energy focused into a lance point measured in square inches. The cost of this military system was staggering. Contemporary records indicate that a knight's complete equipment, horse, armor, and weapons cost approximately 150 bezants, equivalent to 3 to 5 years' income for a prosperous merchant. Many knights sold their lands, mortgaged their properties, or borrowed extensively to finance their crusade participation. But beyond the knights were the infantry, the foot soldiers who would prove equally critical to Crusader success. These men carried spears 12 to 15 feet long, swords, axes, and large shields. They wore lighter armor, padded jackets reinforced with metal scales or chainmail if they could afford it, leather armor if they couldn't, While individually less impressive than knights, infantry and disciplined formations could hold ground, withstand cavalry charges, and provide the stable base from which knights could launch their devastating attacks. The Crusader army that departed Europe in 1096 and 1097 was the most formidable military force the Christian world could assemble, equipped with the best weapons medieval technology could produce, motivated by religious fervor that transcended normal human concerns about safety and survival. The march across Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, from May to October 1097, nearly destroyed the crusade before it reached its objectives. The Seljuk Turks, who controlled most of Anatolia, employed scorched earth tactics, destroying water sources, burning crops, poisoning wells, driving away livestock. They harassed the Christian columns with mounted archers, striking from distance and withdrawing before the slower European heavy cavalry could respond. The heat was murderous. Men in chainmail under the Anatolian sun, in summer temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, suffered heat exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke with terrifying regularity. Horses collapsed from thirst and heat. The weak, the sick, and the unlucky died by the hundreds, their bodies left along the march route as grim markers of the army's passage. Water became more precious than gold. Chroniclers recorded instances of men paying 5 bezants for a goatskin of muddy water. Soldiers drank their horses' blood to survive. Some resorted to drinking their own urine. The suffering transcended anything the European soldiers had experienced, but they continued. Religious faith, the promise of salvation, the shame of turning back, peer pressure from companions, and the simple fact that retreat was as dangerous as advance kept the army moving forward. They fought a major battle at Dorylaeum on July 1, 1097, where the united Crusader army defeated a Seljuk Turkish force, demonstrating that European heavy cavalry, properly employed, could defeat Turkish mounted archers in open battle. The victory at Dorylaeum validated Crusader tactics and gave them confidence, but it didn't end the suffering. The march continued through devastating heat, across terrain that offered little food or water, against an enemy who struck from shadows and vanished before retaliation was possible. Baldwin of Boulogne, brother of Godfrey, diverted from the main army in September 1097 to seize the Armenian city of Edessa, establishing the First Crusader state. His departure reduced the main army's strength, but demonstrated that the Crusaders weren't simply pilgrims but conquerors staking territorial claims. By October 1097, when the Crusader army finally reached Antioch, they numbered perhaps 40,000 people, down from the 60,000 who had departed Europe. Disease, combat, heat, and desertion had claimed the rest. But those who remained were hardened veterans who had survived a journey that would have broken lesser men. They reached Antioch on October 21, 1097, and looked upon one of the most formidable fortifications in the world. Antioch was not merely a city, but a fortress that had withstood sieges for over 1,000 years. The walls, originally built by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century and constantly reinforced over subsequent centuries, stretched for over 9 miles, enclosing approximately 1,000 acres. The walls stood 40 feet high in most places, up to 60 feet in critical sections, and were thick enough that 3 men could walk abreast along their top. The fortifications incorporated 450 towers positioned at regular intervals, each tower rising above the wall height and providing firing positions that created overlapping fields of fire along the entire perimeter. Attackers approaching the walls faced arrow fire, stone fire, boiling oil, and every defensive weapon medieval warfare had developed. The topography made siege warfare even more difficult. The northern portion of the city climbed the steep slopes of Mount Silpius, with walls ascending terrain so steep that assault was nearly impossible. The southern and western approaches were more accessible, but heavily fortified with additional defensive works. The garrison, commanded by Yagisian, the Turkish governor, numbered approximately 7,000 trained warriors plus militia. They had ample food supplies, multiple water sources including wells and the Orontes River flowing nearby, and the confidence that came from defending impregnable fortifications. The Crusader leadership understood that direct assault was suicidal. The walls were too high, too thick, too well defended. Mining, digging tunnels under walls to collapse them, was nearly impossible given the rocky terrain and the defenders' counter-mining capabilities. That left starvation, surrounding the city and waiting until the defenders ran out of food and surrendered. On October 21, 1097, the Crusaders began the siege of Antioch. They would maintain it for 8 months, enduring conditions that pushed human endurance beyond any reasonable limits. The Crusader army lacked sufficient numbers to completely encircle Antioch. 9 miles of walls required many more men than they possessed to prevent all entry and exit. The defenders used this weakness to send out sorties, attacking Crusader positions, bringing in supplies, and maintaining communication with the outside world. The Crusaders built fortifications opposite several gates, attempting to control key entry points. They constructed wooden towers and defensive positions, dividing the army into sections responsible for specific wall sections. But gaps remained, and Turkish cavalry exploited these gaps relentlessly. Food became the defining challenge. The surrounding countryside, initially able to provide some supplies, was quickly stripped bare. Crusaders had to range farther and farther to find food, making foraging expeditions increasingly dangerous as Turkish forces ambushed supply parties. By December 1097, 2 months into the siege, hunger was killing more Crusaders than combat. Horses were slaughtered for meat, first the weakest, then eventually even destriers as starvation overrode military necessity. Men ate grass, leaves, roots, anything that might provide nutrition. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres recorded that men boiled and ate leather from shields and saddles. Winter made conditions worse. Rain turned the siege camps into mud. Disease spread through the malnourished army. Dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses killed hundreds. Some knights, unable to endure the suffering, deserted and fled back toward Constantinople. Peter the Hermit, one of the Crusade's original inspirational leaders, attempted to desert, but was captured and brought back. The suffering was so extreme that even the leaders considered abandoning the siege. On multiple occasions, councils of war debated withdrawal. Only the shame of failure, the knowledge that retreat would mean the Crusade's end, and Bohemond's persuasive arguments kept the army in position. By March 1098, 5 months into the siege, the Crusader army was a shadow of its former strength. Disease and starvation had reduced the fighting force to perhaps 20,000 people. Horses were so scarce that many knights fought on foot. Armor was sold for food. Weapons were traded for bread. The army was dying, and everyone knew it. Then, in May 1098, 2 events changed everything. Bohemond of Taranto had been negotiating secretly with an Armenian tower commander named Firuz, whose tower controlled a critical section of the southern wall. The exact nature of their agreement remains debated. Historians argue whether Firuz was bribed, blackmailed, or convinced through religious arguments, but the result was clear. On the night of June 3, 1098, Firuz would open his tower to Crusader forces. Bohemond proposed the plan to the other leaders with one condition: whoever entered the city first would claim it as their own territory. The desperate leaders agreed. On the night of June 3rd, 60 knights led by Bohemond approached Firuz's tower. Ladders were raised. The knights climbed in darkness and entered the tower. Firuz kept his word. No alarm was raised. The knights descended into the city and rushed to the nearest gate, the Gate of St. George. They killed the guards, broke the locks, and opened the gate. Crusader forces poured through. The cry went up throughout the siege camps. Antioch was open. The army surged forward, entering through the Gate of St. George, and other gates quickly opened from inside. What followed was a night of slaughter. The Crusaders, starving and desperate, driven by 8 months of suffering and religious fury, showed no mercy. Turkish soldiers, civilian Muslims, anyone who resisted or simply appeared threatening was cut down. The streets ran with blood. Chroniclers recorded that the killing continued until dawn, when thousands of Turkish bodies littered the streets and the Christian banners flew from Antioch's walls. Yavuz, the Turkish governor, fled the city with his personal guard, but was captured and killed by Armenian peasants. His head was brought back to Antioch and presented to the Crusader leaders. The Crusaders had taken Antioch, but their celebration lasted less than a day. On June 4, 1098, scouts brought devastating news. Kerboga, Atabeg of Mosul, was approaching with a massive relief army. Intelligence estimates placed his force at 60,000 to 70,000 men, including heavy cavalry, mounted archers, and infantry from across the Muslim world. His army outnumbered the Crusaders by at least 4 to 1, possibly 5 to 1. The besiegers had become the besieged. The Crusaders now held Antioch, but Kerboga's army surrounded the city. The irony was bitter. They had survived 8 months of starvation to capture the city, only to face starvation again, this time with a massive enemy army outside the walls. The food situation was desperate. Antioch's population had been consuming their supplies during the siege. When the Crusaders entered, they found the storehouses largely empty. The army that had been starving for months was still starving, now trapped inside the walls they had fought so hard to breach. Morale collapsed. Knights who had survived the march across Anatolia and 8 months of siege began deserting in large numbers. Stephen of Blois, one of the most prominent leaders, fled with his forces, abandoning the city and the crusade. Others considered following. The army was on the verge of disintegration. Then came the second miracle. On June 10, 1098, a peasant named Peter Bartholomew approached the Crusader leadership with an extraordinary claim. He had experienced visions of St. Andrew, who revealed that the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, was buried beneath the church of St. Peter in Antioch. The leadership was skeptical. Raymond of Toulouse believed the visions. Bohemond and others suspected Peter Bartholomew was a fraud or delusional. But desperate circumstances made them willing to investigate. On June 14th, workers began excavating beneath the church floor. They dug all day without finding anything. As evening approached and skepticism grew, Peter Bartholomew jumped into the excavation pit and moments later emerged holding an iron lance point. Whether this was genuine discovery, planted evidence, or providential miracle remains debated by historians. But the effect on the army was immediate and dramatic. News of the Holy Lance spread through Antioch like wildfire. The starving, desperate soldiers believed they now possessed the weapon that had touched Christ's blood. Divine favor had clearly returned. God had not abandoned them. The discovery transformed the army's psychology from despair to fanatical confidence. Bishop Adhemar of Les Puys, the Crusade's spiritual leader, declared a 3-day fast and prayer vigil. For an army already starving, this seemed sadistic, but it served a purpose. It focused the soldiers' minds on spiritual matters. It unified them in shared religious practice. It transformed their suffering from meaningless hunger into holy sacrifice. On June 28, 1098, 25 days after entering Antioch, the Crusader leadership made a decision that seemed insane by military standards. They would sortie from the city and attack Kerboga's vastly superior army in open battle. The Crusader army that prepared to exit Antioch on June 28 numbered approximately 15,000 men, possibly fewer. Contemporary chroniclers disagree on exact numbers, but all agree the Christian force was vastly outnumbered. Kerboga's army surrounded the city with between 60,000 and 70,000 warriors. The Crusaders had perhaps 200 knights still mounted on horses. The rest of the cavalry fought on foot, their destriers long since eaten or dead from starvation. The infantry were emaciated skeletons held together by armor and faith. Many men could barely walk, let alone fight. By every military calculation, The sortie should have resulted in their total annihilation. But Bohemond and the other leaders understood something critical. Remaining in Antioch meant certain death by starvation. Surrendering meant enslavement or execution. Fighting offered the only possibility, however remote, of survival. And the discovery of the Holy Lance had given the army something beyond military capability. It had given them absolute faith that God would ensure their victory. The battle plan was simple. The entire army would exit through the bridge gate, the only gate that opened to relatively flat terrain suitable for deployment. They would form up outside the walls in organized divisions and attack directly toward Kerboga's main force. The simplicity was necessary because the starving army lacked the strength for complex maneuvers. They would advance, maintain formation, and trust that shock impact and religious fervor would compensate for their numerical inferiority. Raymond of Aguilers, chaplain to Raymond of Toulouse and eyewitness to the battle, recorded the scene as the gates opened and the Crusaders emerged. The army exited in organized divisions, each commanded by one of the major leaders. Godfrey of Bouillon led the first division, followed by Robert of Normandy, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond commanding the reserve. The Holy Lance was carried at the army's center, visible to all as a banner of divine favor. Kerboga initially couldn't believe what he was seeing. The starving defenders were voluntarily leaving their fortifications to attack his vastly superior force. He apparently assumed this was a desperate sortie that would quickly retreat. He positioned his forces to envelope and destroy the Christians once they committed to battle. But the Crusaders didn't retreat. They advanced in tight formation, maintaining cohesion despite their weakness. The divisions moved forward in coordinated waves, covering each other's flanks, presenting an organized front to the Turkish forces. The Muslim army, confident in their numerical superiority, advanced to meet them. The mounted archers, the core of Turkish military power, swept forward to harass the Christian formations with arrows, the standard tactic that had proven so effective. Then something unexpected happened. The Crusader infantry held formation despite the arrow storm. Men fell, struck by arrows finding gaps in armor or weak points, but the formations didn't break. The survivors closed ranks and continued forward. The infantry, equipped with long spears and large shields, presented a wall of wood and steel that the Turkish light cavalry couldn't easily penetrate. The Turkish archers wheeled away, refusing close combat, shooting and withdrawing as their tactics dictated. But the Crusaders didn't pursue. They maintained formation and continued their steady advance. This was utterly unlike the behavior Kerboga's forces had come to expect from Crusader armies, who typically charged recklessly after fleeing enemies. Bohemond had learned from the march across Anatolia. He understood that Turkish mounted archers' greatest advantage was mobility, their ability to stay just beyond reach while inflicting casualties. His solution was discipline. Keep the formations tight. Accept casualties from arrows. Wait until the decisive moment to commit the cavalry. As the Crusader army advanced, the Muslim forces found themselves unable to employ their usual tactics effectively. The Christian formations were too disciplined to break under arrow fire. The infantry wall prevented easy penetration. The steady advance was forcing Kerboga's army backward despite their overwhelming numbers. Then Bohemond unleashed the cavalry reserve. The 200 mounted knights that remained, supplemented by knights who had scavenged horses from somewhere or fought on foot, charged directly at Kerboga's center. The impact was devastating. The heavily armored knights, backed by destriers, struck the Muslim line like a battering ram. The lance charge, that terrible momentum of man and horse focused into a steel point, punched through the lighter Turkish cavalry. Once in close quarters, the knights wielded their swords and maces, each blow backed by the training and equipment that made them individually superior to any opponent. The Turkish center buckled. Gaps appeared in their formation. The Crusader infantry, following behind the knights, poured through these gaps. The organized Muslim army began fragmenting into smaller units fighting independently. Then the psychological collapse began. Turkish commanders, seeing their center break, began ordering retreats to reform their lines. But retreat in the face of a charging enemy is dangerous. Disciplined retreat is difficult, even for well-trained troops. For an army that had expected easy victory and instead found itself in a desperate fight, retreat became rout. Muslim soldiers began fleeing the battlefield in increasing numbers. The emirs and commanders tried to rally their forces, but panic was spreading faster than orders could be communicated. Within 2 hours of the battle's start, Kerboga's massive army was in full retreat, abandoning their camp, their supplies, their siege equipment, everything in their desperate flight. The Crusaders pursued as far as their exhausted bodies allowed, cutting down stragglers and capturing abandoned equipment. When they returned to Antioch that evening, they brought captured supplies, horses, weapons, and most importantly, food from Kerboga's abandoned camp. The impossible had happened. 15,000 starving Crusaders had defeated an army of 70,000. The First Crusade had survived. The victory at Antioch defied military logic to such an extent that both Christian and Muslim sources struggled to explain it. Christian chroniclers attributed it entirely to divine intervention. God had granted victory to his faithful servants. Muslim chroniclers blamed Kerboga's poor leadership, the disunity among his emirs, the lack of commitment from some contingents who resented Mosul's dominance. Modern historians analyzing the battle identify several factors beyond divine providence. Kerboga's army, while large, was a coalition of forces from different regions with varying degrees of commitment and coordination problems. The Crusader army, though small, was unified by shared suffering and religious fervor. The defensive advantages normally held by besiegers were negated when the Crusaders attacked, catching Kerboga's forces in transition between siege positions and battle formation. But perhaps the most significant factor was psychological. The Crusaders believed absolutely that they would win. The Holy Lance had convinced them of God's direct intervention. Men who believe they cannot lose fight with a fury and commitment that transcends rational military calculations. The Turkish forces, conversely, expected easy victory. When the battle didn't go as anticipated, when their numerical advantage didn't immediately overwhelm the Christians, doubt crept in. Once doubt infected the army, cohesion collapsed. The battle demonstrated that morale and psychological factors could overcome material disadvantages. The Crusaders weren't stronger or more numerous. They were more desperate and more convinced of their cause. After Antioch, the crusade remained stalled for months. Disease, particularly an epidemic that swept through Antioch, killing Bishop Ademar among thousands of others, weakened the army. Political disputes over who would control Antioch divided the leadership. Bohemond claimed the city based on the agreement made before entering, but Raymond of Toulouse disputed this, arguing that all conquests should go to the Byzantine Empire or remain under collective Crusader control. The disputes delayed the march toward Jerusalem until January 1099, when the crusade finally resumed. The army numbered perhaps 14,000 fighters, the survivors of the original 60,000 who had departed Europe. They were veterans now, hardened by 2 years of the most brutal warfare medieval soldiers could experience. The march down the coast of Syria and Palestine faced less resistance than anticipated. Muslim forces, divided among competing emirates and shocked by the Antioch victory, largely avoided direct confrontation. Cities either surrendered, paid tribute, or were bypassed. The Crusaders reached Jerusalem in June 1099. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 5 weeks. The city was strongly fortified but held a relatively small garrison. The Crusaders built siege towers, moved them against the walls on July 14th and 15th, and captured the city in fierce fighting. What followed was a massacre that shocked even medieval observers. For 3 days, the Crusaders slaughtered Muslims and Jews indiscriminately. Contemporary estimates place the death toll between 20,000 and 70,000. The First Crusade had achieved its objective. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The victory transformed medieval Europe's relationship with the Islamic world and established Crusader states that would endure for 2 centuries. The victory at Antioch became legendary in Christian Europe. It validated the entire Crusade concept, proving that faith, courage, and European military capabilities could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The battle established patterns that would define Crusader warfare for generations. The heavy cavalry charge remained the Crusader tactical centerpiece. Despite its limitations and the many times it failed, when properly employed against the right enemy at the right moment, it was devastatingly effective. Muslim commanders learned to avoid circumstances that favored the charge, but they also learned to respect its power. The combination of heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry, demonstrated at Antioch, became standard Crusader doctrine. The infantry provided the stable base, the cavalry provided the decisive shock. Neither was effective alone, but together they created a combined arms force that could compete against numerically superior opponents. The religious dimension proved to be both strength and weakness. The faith that sustained Crusaders through Antioch's suffering also led to the Jerusalem massacre and countless other atrocities. The absolute certainty of divine favor that gave them courage to attack 70,000 Muslims also made them inflexible and arrogant in later campaigns. The military orders that would come to dominate Crusader warfare, the Templars and Hospitallers, were founded partly in response to First Crusade experiences. The need for permanent, professional forces who could maintain skills and readiness year-round, rather than relying on periodic crusades of European nobles, led to the creation of these warrior monk organizations. For the Muslim world, Antioch was a wake-up call. The Crusaders weren't merely raiders or temporary invaders who would leave after achieving limited goals. They were conquerors who established permanent settlements and showed no intention of departing. The defeat at Antioch revealed critical weaknesses in the regional Muslim military structure. The Turkish Emirates were politically divided, often fighting each other as much as they fought external enemies. Kerbogha's coalition army demonstrated that assembling large forces was possible, but coordination and unified command remained problematic. Muslim military thinkers began analyzing Crusader tactics and developing countermeasures. The vulnerability of knights to horse archery if they could be kept at distance, the extreme logistical requirements of Crusader armies, the dependence on fortified positions, all became recognized and exploited in later campaigns. Saladin, the commander who would eventually recapture Jerusalem in 1187, built his strategies partly on lessons learned from defeats like Antioch. Unity of command, disciplined forces, exploiting Crusader weaknesses, avoiding their strengths. These became principles of Muslim strategy against the Crusader states. Modern historians view the First Crusade, and particularly the Antioch campaign, as one of medieval warfare's most remarkable achievements. The fact that a European army could march 3,000 miles, most of it through hostile territory, survive countless battles and sieges, endure starvation and disease, and still achieve its objectives represents an extraordinary feat of endurance and military capability. The victory at Antioch specifically demonstrated several military principles that transcend its medieval context. Morale and psychology can compensate for material disadvantages. Disciplined troops can overcome numerical inferiority. Desperate circumstances can produce extraordinary courage. Unified command and clear objectives, even in desperate situations, create opportunities for victory. But historians also note the tremendous human cost. Of the approximately 60,000 people who departed Europe on the First Crusade, fewer than 15,000 survived to see Jerusalem captured. Disease killed more than combat. Starvation killed more than Turkish arrows. The suffering was immense by any standard. The question of whether the objectives justified the costs remains debated. From a medieval Christian perspective, recapturing Jerusalem and establishing Christian rule over holy sites justified any sacrifice. From a modern perspective, the costs in human suffering, the establishment of antagonistic relationships between Christian and Muslim worlds that persist today, and the questionable morality of religious warfare make the assessment more complicated. The Siege of Antioch and the Battle of June 28, 1098, have been studied, analyzed, and mythologized for over 9 centuries. The siege appears in medieval chronicles, Renaissance paintings, Victorian Romantic literature, and modern historical analysis. Each generation finds different meanings in the story. Medieval audiences saw divine intervention and the triumph of faith. Renaissance humanists saw the complexity of human motivation and the interplay of politics and religion. Victorian Romantics saw chivalric heroism and exotic adventure. Modern historians see the brutal realities of medieval warfare and the human capacity for both remarkable endurance and terrible violence. What remains undisputed is the achievement. 15,000 starving men defeated an army 5 times their size. An expedition that seemed doomed multiple times survived and achieved its objective. The First Crusade succeeded where logic suggested it should have failed catastrophically. Brother Raymond of Aguilars, who survived the entire crusade and witnessed the victory at Antioch, recorded his reflections years later in his chronicle. "We stood on the edge of annihilation so many times that survival itself seemed miraculous. At Antioch, trapped in the city we had fought 8 months to capture, facing an enemy that outnumbered us 5 to 1, every rational calculation said we would die. But we had faith that transcended reason. We believed God would grant us victory, and that belief gave us strength to attempt the impossible. When we emerged from those gates and attacked an army that should have destroyed us, we were already victorious in our hearts. The actual battle merely confirmed what faith had already established. Whether you believe this was divine intervention or human psychology or some combination, the result was the same. The impossible became real. The doomed became victorious. Antioch taught us that the human spirit, properly motivated, can overcome any obstacle. On June 28, 1098, as the sun set over the plains of Antioch, it illuminated a battlefield covered not with Christian bodies as expected, but with the abandoned supplies and equipment of a routed Turkish army. The Crusaders returned to Antioch carrying food, weapons, and most importantly, the validation that their suffering had not been meaningless. The victory at Antioch ensured the First Crusade's survival. Without it, the expedition would have ended in the starving death of its participants inside the city they'd captured. Jerusalem would have remained in Muslim hands. The history of crusades, of Christian-Muslim relations, of medieval warfare would have taken entirely different paths. The armored knight, fighting on religious faith and desperate courage, had proven capable of extraordinary achievements. The victory validated European confidence in their military systems and their divine favor. It established patterns of warfare, religious conviction, and cultural interaction that would shape the next 2 centuries. But Antioch also demonstrated the costs of such victories. The suffering of 8 months of siege, the deaths from disease and starvation, the desperation that drove men to eat leather and grass, the ultimate willingness to launch a suicidal attack rather than die passively. These revealed the extremes of human endurance and the prices people will pay for religious and political objectives. The Crusaders who survived Antioch were forever changed. They had looked into the abyss of death and somehow survived. They had experienced suffering beyond anything civilians could imagine. They had killed with religious fury and survived through desperate courage. These weren't the same men who had departed Europe in 1096. They were harder, more ruthless, more certain of their divine mission. The march continued to Jerusalem and ultimate victory. But the character of the crusade was forged at Antioch in 8 months of starvation and one impossible battle. The lessons written in blood on those plains, that faith could overcome reason, that courage could defeat numbers, that desperate men were capable of impossible victories, these lessons would inspire crusaders for 2 centuries. And then at Hattin in 1187, those same lessons would prove catastrophically wrong. The victories that faith and courage achieved at Antioch would be reversed by similar faith and courage employed stupidly on different terrain against a smarter enemy. But in June 1098, as the surviving Crusaders celebrated inside Antioch, eating captured food and praising God for their deliverance, the future disasters were unimaginable. They had won the impossible victory. They had proven their divine favor. They were conquerors marching toward Jerusalem. The crusade would succeed. The cost would be counted later. The reckoning would come at Hattin. But at Antioch, on June 28, 1098, the starving army that emerged from those gates and shattered an army 5 times their size had proved that in war, courage and faith sometimes do prevail against overwhelming odds. The thunder of those charges has long faded. The knights who fought there are dust. The religious certainties that drove them seem alien to modern sensibilities. But the achievement remains, carved into history as one of medieval warfare's most improbable victories. 15,000 against 70,000. Starvation against plenty. Desperation against confidence. And against all logic, desperation won.